Let's look at one way to restore an antique finish. We'll start with a demonstration using Briwax. I'll apply a mid-brown color to an antique rocking chair, and that gets applied with a 4/0 steel wool. After that demonstration, we'll head right back to the bench and look at several colors to see which might be best for your project. Okay, so just time for a little bit of light wool and wax, just to bring the luster and a little finish back up to it. And we'll apply this wax and buff it back, and that'll about conclude things for the restoration of the wood components, and all that'll remain is just the upholstery job. Typical on an antique rocking chair, spots where the chair is bumped up against a painted wall. So a little bit of wax and wool can usually buff most of those out without any kind of refinishing. Just spend a minute with them with the wax and wool until the white spots are gone, and you'll be amazed what that does for the look of an old rocker. If this was a finish on a new rocking chair, we'd call it a hand rub finish. It's probably one notch below a satin sheen that the paste wax gives you, and that's just right for arts and crafts furniture. Give the paste wax a final buffing with a clean cloth, and you're all set. That's all there is to restoring the wood frame of the rocking chair. Back at the bench here, we have a few of these colors to look at. There's a light brown, a mid brown, and a dark brown, but there's also a Tudor brown and an antique mahogany. Now, my sample board has been finished to replicate an antique finish, but it doesn't have a real top coat on there. There is some shellac as an intermediate layer here, but I left the top coat off just to simulate an antique piece of wood. Even the light brown looks very dark in the can, but you'll be surprised it doesn't actually add that much color. Just put a small amount on a piece of 4/0 steel wool, and you can apply that to one section. So on this particular sample board, virtually no change in color with the light brown. It just adds a little bit of luster and gives the board some protection. This mid brown is the one that I used most often, and it's the one we demonstrated on that antique rocker. And so let's just have a quick look at how that appears on this same sample board. So under close inspection, you might notice that it darkens the pores just a little bit, but again, it's a very subtle effect. It's mostly just about restoring the luster of the finish. The dark brown is just too dark for most finishes. I will use it occasionally if I have a dark finish that's came that way from the factory and it just almost looks black, then it would be appropriate with the dark brown. I really think it's a mistake to try to use Briwax to change the color of a finish. Just try to match it as closely to what you already have and just restore what's there. The Tudor brown I don't use quite as often. We'll just do a little strip of that so you can see what color effects you get. A little bit of a red undertone on that, not quite as dark as the dark brown wax. Can be a good option if you have a mid-tone piece of furniture that you don't mind the red showing through a little bit. And finally, the antique mahogany. This one has more of a red color to it. And so I don't use this one very often. I usually lean on the mid-brown color or the light brown color, are my two most commonly used waxes. But this one really has a red tone, so only use this if you want to bring out the natural red colors in the finish that you're applying it to. And you can see a little bit of that sheen coming back to the wood. And very subtle differences between these colors. Then let's try the waxes on bare wood. This is white oak, and this is the light brown. So with just raw wood, it soaks in a little bit, but you can see it's just not as dark as you think it might be. The mid brown next, and there's a significant difference in the color between these two on raw wood, but not such a big difference if you're going over an antique finish. Dark brown. And this is just too dark for a lot of the antiques that we have and restore. And so just choose wisely. If you think you might want to go with the dark, my advice would be to start with the mid-brown first and only go this next level if you absolutely have to. This dark brown tends to change the color of your piece, and that's not something I'm usually trying to do when I'm just simply restoring an antique. Here's the Tudor brown. Again, a little bit of a red to it, but it's still a nice dark color. Only use that if your piece already has some red and you want to encourage that color. So once it's wiped back, the Tudor brown is not nearly as dark as the dark brown, and it has quite a bit of red undertone. The last color we'll look at is an antique mahogany, and not quite as dark as the last one, and a bit more red to it. So this one doesn't really fit the bill for a lot of my projects just because there's too much red in it, but use that if you want to accentuate the red in something that's already there. And then finally, I thought it might be interesting to look at a sample board that just has dyes applied at various concentrations and talk about when I might choose each of these waxes. So on these two, I would choose the light brown. This one might be a good choice for mid brown. This one I would probably choose mid brown myself, but I'll show it with a dark brown just so you can see the effect over a raw dye like that. Starting out with the light brown over this very light, almost a blonde dye. A little more wax on there with the light, and we'll see what that does. Even though there's no top coat there, it doesn't change the color too much, but does add to the effect a little bit. I think it helps brings out some of those ray flecks, and we'll wipe that back. So it maintains a fairly light look, but just brings out a little bit of the sheen. Looks pretty good on a very light finish. A slightly darker dye, we'll go light brown wax on that again to see what the effect is. A little better color change on that. Brings out a nice richness in that light oak color. Then let's do a mid brown to see how that looks. Again, right over this wood that has just been dyed, no other treatments applied to it. And this mid brown is really my favorite, as long as you're not dealing with a very light finish. See how pretty that looks with a mid brown finish? I just love that color. Nice sheen and luster restored to it. That's exactly what I want on most of my antiques. And last but not least, we'll do a dark brown on this darkest sample. If this was actually an antique, I would probably go with the mid brown because that most closely matches what it is. But just for demonstration purposes, let's see what it looks like with an application of the dark brown Briwax. Work it with and against the grain before you wipe it back. Sometimes when you're applying these toluene based waxes, you want to let things off gas for a night or two out in the garage or workshop. The smell bothers some people. I'm not bothered by it at all, but you can wear a respirator if you need to, but at least let it off gas before you bring it in the house. And that gives you quite a bit darker finish with that dark brown wax. So if you've got an antique or just a piece of furniture that you need to restore the luster to, I would recommend this Briwax. It's got a little bit of color, but don't think about it in terms of changing the color with this. You're just restoring the color, restoring a little bit of luster, and it's really nice to cover up some minor scratches too. So give it a try. I think you'll like it. If you're going to only choose one color and you don't have very dark furniture, go with the light brown. Otherwise, the mid brown is very good for medium to dark finishes.